Welcome back. In this section, we are going to actually start replacing the Redux in our application with the new Context API. And it's quite simple to get started with, but there's a few caveats and patterns, of course, that we need to understand in order to properly use it. Now, let's start with an easy component to replace. The first thing that we're going to do is we are going to look at our collection component. Now, currently, our collection component leverages the select collection selector and Redux, of course, in order to pull in the collection item. So, of course, we are using our select collection selector, which is pulling off the collections map object from our shop reducer. Now, you might not have seen this reducer in a while because it's been a little bit since we've seen it in this state. But in this application, shop data is a local file, if you remember, when we first instantiated our shop data. It's still the object that we know it as. The only difference is that we were instantiating it as initial state inside of our shop reducer. So we're going to do pretty much the same thing except using Context API instead of a reducer. But conceptually, they serve a very similar purpose. A reducer is just an object that stores data that we pull into our components using selectors. The Context API you can kind of see like a reducer. So I'm going to write out a little bit of code, and I want you to just follow along for now. Type along, and I'll explain to you what it is once we write it. But it's actually very simple. So inside of our source folder, you're going to make a new folder. And you're going to call it context. And in here is going to store our new context files, as well as the folders that represent what they are. So we're going to make a new one, and we're going to call it our collections. So it's just collections. And inside of collections, we'll make a new collections.context.js. So this context is only going to store our collections object, right? That massive object that holds all of our collection items. And in order to make this new context, we have to import in this method from React called createContext from React. And all it is it is a method that can take anything. It can take strings, integers, objects, functions, whatever you want it to be, arrays, anything. And why it's so flexible is because that's literally what it's storing as its initial state. So that context is going to be the thing that we pull and store the values that we want inside of our components. So let me show you how we're going to do that. So first, we're going to make a new value, and we're going to call it collections context, right? So make sure to capitalize the C because we're going to use it like a component. And we're just going to say create context here. And we're going to pass it our shop data. So if you remember, inside of our Redux folder for our shop data is this file. So I just want you to copy it and then paste it into our context collections folder. Paste it in. And then just import that into this file. So import in that shop data object from our shop data and pass this into your create context. So what we're doing here is we're saying, I want you to create this new context called collections context that stores this shop data. And this will be the initial value of our context. We can, of course, set the value later dynamically. But we won't do that yet. We first got to understand how we consume it, because now we have an initial state in this context, our shop data. So we're just going to export this out as the default value from this file. And then inside of our collections component, we are now going to replace our existing Redux implementation of getting the collection. And how we're going to do that is we are going to first import in our new context that we just made. So import in your collections context from our context /collections/collections context. And now in order to use it, we actually need to get the value into our component. So before, the way that we did it was with our connect higher order component and then map state to propsing our collection into our component as a prop. But we're not going to do that anymore. So just remove this connect because we're not going to leverage Redux anymore. What we are going to do is we are going to use this new collections context. Now I'm going to show you the two ways that we can get the value that we've stored in this context into our component. The first way is that we use collections context as a component. So this is actually the more complicated way to use it. But the way that it works is that you use it as a component and you wrap the part of the application where you want access to whatever is stored inside of this context. So in our case, it's our shop data. Well, I want access to it inside of this component. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to wrap this entire div here inside of the collection context as a component, but I'm going to call .consumer. And the .consumer just means that I want to leverage the collections context consumer component. There's only two components here. There's a consumer and there's a provider, but we'll look at the provider later. What we want to do is consume the value, so we'll use the consumer. And we'll wrap this entire div inside of it. Now, in order to actually access what we have stored inside of this context, we have access to it in the form of a function. And this function we can leverage the same way that we pretty much use to render anything inside of these JavaScript curly braces in our JSX. We get access to our stored object, right, as the parameter that gets passed into this function. So in our case, it's collections. And what we want to do is we want to actually pluck the specific collection object that we want off of this collections. So if you remember, what we were doing before is we were using this selector. But now instead, we are going to manually pull it off instead of using the selector. So what we'll say is instead of passing in collection like this, right, we actually just want the match property. We are going to say const collection equals our collections object at that collection ID. So as you remember, collection ID is the URL parameter value of our specific collection page. So if it's /hats, then it's hats. If it's /women, then it's women, right, et cetera, et cetera. So if you remember, our collections is an object map. We're getting that specific collection based on this parameter. And now we want to pluck off the title and the items. And then out of this function, we are going to return all of this HTML that represents what we need to render. And just like that, that's all it is. We just made sure to wrap the part of our component that needs access to what's stored inside of our context. We called collections context.consumer, and we got the ability to pass this function that has access to the value that we stored in our context. So now if we go back to our application, we'll see that if we navigate to this page, it still works, right? Everything is the exact same. And that's pretty much all the context API is it allows us to store and then pull these values into our components because the value is stored on this context that we can pass and import into the components that need it. Now, I'll show you how to dynamically set the value later, but let me show you the other way, the easier way for us to actually leverage this context value inside of our components without having to introduce another component that wraps our component itself. So we're going to first undo all this code that we just wrote, right? Let's just go back to what we had before. What we're going to do here is we are going to import in a new hook called useContext. And what useContext does is it allows us to get the value inside of our context and store it as a const inside of our component. So it's very easy because what we can do is we can say const collection is equal to use context, and then what we pass in is the context we want to use. So we got to make sure to also switch this back to match, right? Now, if you remember, what we are getting back is our collections object. So here, we can make sure to set our collection equal to our new collections at our match.params.collection ID. And now, if we go back to our application, it still works, right? It's much easier to refactor using the new use context hook. It's that simple. That's all it is. When we call use context, it will literally just pull whatever value the collection context is storing and then cast it to whatever const we want to set it to. So it's a really easy hook to use, and this is pretty much all we need in order to use it. But we've pretty much replaced our redux that we were using before to get that collection object value. In fact, let's get rid of all of the redux bindings that we had here. So let's just make sure to get rid of this because we don't need this anymore. We don't need the map state to props. We don't need the connect, and we don't need the selector. Let's save, and let's make sure everything still works. So if we refresh, there it is, right? We see that we're still pulling in the context and we're still leveraging our new collections map inside of the context. So that's it. That's pretty much all it is in order to consume the context API. Now, what about dynamically setting the value? Because right now we're pretty much just leveraging the initial state, right? We're leveraging initial state based on what we passed into the context when we first instantiated it. But what if we want to dynamically update the value, right? The way that we were doing before when we dispatched actions that updated our reducers, how do we actually dynamically update the context? Well, that's exactly what we're going to explore in the next lesson.